Professor Riabchuk, hello, very wonderful to see you.
It's my pleasure. You hear me?
I can hear you very well, thank you. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes.
No problem, no rush. I worry a bit about connection, but I hope it will work. We'll see. Usually it works, but things happen.
Yes, well, we'll hope for the best, but we've gotten used to dealing with these challenges, haven't we?
Yeah. Do you plan to place all this speeches, conference in the web?
So with the presenter's permission, we shall. So we will be in touch. I guess I should ask your permission now. Is it okay to record your speech?
Absolutely, absolutely, okay. Definitely, and desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Right. And we can talk later about where it will live, so to speak. So
okay, thank you.
So welcome back, everyone, to the 4th annual Indiana University Taras Shevchenko Ukrainian Studies Conference. It's been a wonderful entire day yesterday and half of a morning today for us here in Bloomington, Indiana, getting to know better the work of our non-residential scholars. Thank you so much to everyone who has been so generous in presenting your work, for feedback, and we look forward to many more discussions with you. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm a professor of anthropology at Indiana University, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, a scholar who needs no introduction, of course, and however, it does fall to me to try to make such an introduction, so I will do my best. I've been a fan of yours, Professor Riabchuk, ever since 1994. The first time I met you in Kyiv. I'm certain you don't remember me, but I remember you. I was a young graduate student being taken around the city by my colleague, Michael Naidan, from Penn State, and have followed your work ever since with great admiration. So let me get to the introduction, and I apologize in advance if I'm leaving out important details, which I'm sure I am, because there's so much and too much to fit into a short introduction, but here we go. Dr. Mykola Riabchuk is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Political and Nationalities Studies of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. He has also recently been a lecturer at the University of Warsaw, a visiting researcher at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies, a visiting researcher at Princeton University, and a fellow at the Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. He has penned a dozen books, translated into several languages, and many articles and book chapters, primarily on post-communist transformation, state nation building, national identity, and Ukrainian-Russian relations. His latest publications in English include the book Eastern Europe Since 1989, Between the Loosened Authoritarianism and Unconsolidated Democracy, published in Warsaw in 2020, and At the Fence of Metternich Garden, Essays on Europe, Ukraine, and Europeanization, published in Stuttgart in 2021. In 2014 to 2018, Dr. Riabchuk headed the Ukrainian Center of PEN International and retained the title of its honorary president. His work was distinguished also with the Benemerito Medal of the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2009 for a significant contribution in Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, and also the Taras Shevchenko National Prize in Arts and Literature in 2022, the prize funds of which, as I understand, he donated to the Ukrainian armed forces. There may be other appointments, accomplishments that you would like to highlight, but for now, I think we all get the point that we are in the presence of a very distinguished scholar, and we're very, very grateful that you have agreed to give the keynote address today. And the title of Dr. Riabchuk's keynote address is Mapping a Nowhere Nation: Imperial Knowledge and Challenges of Decolonization. So please, Professor Riabchuk, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, very much. And thank you and your colleagues for inviting me, for giving me such a great opportunity. I'm really proud to deliver this speech, and I'll do my best. Let me start from some personal remarks in order to move from small things to broader picture. Just, a couple of days ago, I got a message from my American colleague who apparently wanted to please me, and who sent me quotation from Ryszard Kapuscinski's book, this old book published 30 years ago called Imperial. But there was quotation by Kapuscinski, reference to Mykola Riabchuk as one of best Ukrainian essays. So of course I was pleased, I was proud. I knew this quotation because I knew the book, I knew Mr. Kapuscinski. Actually we have very good, very close relations. I knew this quotation in Polish. It was okay. It was like Mykola Riabchuk, one of several excellent Ukrainian essays. But in English, it sounded Nikolai Riabchuk. Nikolai Riabchuk, one of several excellent Ukrainian essays. So I was not so happy with this quotation, and I wondered why I'm Nikolai. Kapuscinski couldn't write this because he perfectly knew my proper name. Why American translator Russified my name? I could understand if he or she anglicized, if it was translated as Nicholas Riabchuk. Okay, maybe it's some languages, some traditions have this this approach to nationalize names, but they don't make Mykola into Nicholas. They make Nikolai. They do not make Mikhailo into Michael, but in Mikhail. They don't make Yevgen into Eugene, but in Yevgeny, and on and on. The tendency is very clear, and it's the same, all the same in many translations, publications of this kind. So, what is that? What is the reason for this? At first glance, it may look like minor distortions, but these minor distortions are systemic, and they, from my point of view, and as I try to argue eventually, they create tendency when they acquire together, when taken together, they acquire some cumulative power. And we encounter these minor distortions on daily basis. They actually permeate our life. They malform our reality. We immerse, we actually sink in their daily fluid. So here and there, all the time, we learn something like, Dziga Vertov and Dovzhenko and Parajanov are Russian film directors. We learn that Hripenko and is Russian sculptor. Or Taras Bulba was a popular Russian ataman. I happen to find such a footnote. Hopak, of course, is Russian folk dance. It's also another footnote in my collection. Edgar Degas, famous dancers in Ukrainian folk costumes, are Russian dancers in many museums. And of course, Malevich and Burlyuk and Esther are Russian artists, and it comes not only from, from less educated people, it comes from experts, from educated, from highbrow publications and authors. For example, reputable, it's very, very high-level magazine, New York Review of Books, informs readers that Ukrainian language was derived from Russian in the 16th century. For example, also very reputable Davos Business Forum informed its guest a few years ago that even Princess Olga, because she was featured in this, gallery of female heroines. So Princess Olga was 10th century Russian princess. There was no Russia in 10th century, but nonetheless, she was Russian princess. Also very reputable Nobel Prize Committee introduced Ivan Franko in its official website among other contenders, because they list all the contenders, all the candidates, all the nominees, and Franko was listed there as writer from Russia, surprisingly enough. Not to mention dozens of books about Gogol, which are published every year, everywhere, and very rarely they refer to him as Ukrainian, not Ukrainian writer, but just to his Ukrainian roots, to his Ukrainian connections, to his at least partially Ukrainian identity, which cannot be denied completely. But, it's not mentioned at all. It's like, it's bizarre, like to write about James Joyce without mentioning his Irish roots, Irish connections. You cannot imagine such text, such serious writing about James Joyce, but there are a lot of such writings about Gogol. So, very few people notice falsity of these statements. And even those who notice, they very rarely are eager to fight, to disprove, to protest, to write letters, because people usually don't want to transform their life into a kind of crusade, into uphill battle against very minor actually, and seemingly insignificant lies. But they are pervasive, they are mounting, and they are totalizing. They create absolutely alternative reality, which is very, very convenient, very suitable for today's Russian political life. It facilitates spread of this Putinist ideology. It's indeed very difficult. It's almost impossible to run against common wisdom and common sense. It's very difficult to question something that is seemingly normal and everybody knows, something that is multiplied in textbooks and talk shows and is parroted by pundits and pop stars and politicians and journalists. But common wisdom is not God-given, and it's not a scientific truth. It is usually not based on hard sciences, on proved facts and checkable experiments. It's largely based on impressions, on opinions, on interpretations. And none of this is impartial. Common wisdom reflects ideology of those who develop and narrate it. And common wisdom results from specific policies and from discursive strategies of those who have enough power to promote it. In this case, which I intend to present you, we are dealing with a very peculiar kind of common wisdom, which I call imperial knowledge, and not with any imperial knowledge, but specifically with Russian imperial knowledge in our case. Even though this kind of imperial knowledge works in a similar way in different empires, in different situations, and suffice to mention here famous classical book by Edward Said, Orientalism, where he examines how British and French imperial knowledge works, how it operates, and he famously defines this, define Orientalism as a way to manipulate and control Orient. We can define Russian imperial knowledge about Ukraine exactly in the same way. But also there are similar books by Todorov, for example, about Balkans, or Larry Wolff, very, very good about invention of Eastern Europe and on and on. So, I'm not going to invent anything new. I just want to place Ukrainian-Russian case into this, broader context of discursive dominance in context of knowledge as a tool, as instrument of dominance, instrument of power, and of course of manipulation. Let me now define imperial knowledge, how it should be tentatively defined. I follow here a classical book by Eva Thompson. She entitled her book Imperial Knowledge, and I define it as a system of narratives which are developed by imperial ideologues, including also cultural activists. They contribute a lot to imperial knowledge, writers in particular. Narratives which are aimed at two interconnected goals, which reinforce each other, actually. On the one hand, it's a glorification of the empire, of its supposedly great universal culture and its unique historical role. And on the other hand, it's depreciation, marginalization, or just sheer appropriation of cultures of subordinate, of subjugated nations, monopolization of special entitlement to speak on their behalf and mediate between them and the world. Of course, this leads to silencing, to muting these nations and making them completely invisible. Unfortunately, imperial knowledge, in our case, Russian imperial knowledge, was produced for centuries, actually since 18th century, and was produced and disseminated by very powerful imperial institutions. And it strongly influenced Western media and academia and mass culture and common wisdom. It became a kind of scientific knowledge internationally, which is, as I mentioned already, was not scientific. The world, unfortunately, adopted, internalized this knowledge and normalized it, became normal. And if anything is normal, it's unquestionable. Why to question something which is normal? Yeah, the earth is round, and sun rounds around the earth, and on and on. It's, everybody knows it. I just prove you at the beginning of my presentation a few examples of how imperial knowledge works on a daily basis, how it undermines Ukraine's agency and visibility and sovereignty, and ultimately it undermines its existence. It makes make Ukraine not even a country, as Putin put it 15 years ago. Ukraine, unfortunately, happened to be in the very core of that imperial knowledge, of very toxic imperial myth, which established imaginary and largely fictitious political continuity between the medieval Rus and the 17th century Moscow. I don't mean here any connection, because of course there was some kind of dynastic connection, continuity, some kind of ecclesiastic continuity. It can be discussed, but there was absolutely no political continuity. It was invented. It was very modern phenomenon, relatively modern phenomenon, and it was absolutely fictitious. It was done by a very simple semantic trick, by appropriation under Peter the Great of quasi-Latinized name Russia. And this facilitated claims to Rus history, even though it was only very marginally shared with Moscow. And also facilitated claims to the core lands of Rus, which never belonged to Moscow, actually. And the worst of all, and crucially, claims to identity, to Rus identity, which was primarily Ruthenian, that is Ukrainian Belarusia. This means that no room was left in this mythology for Ukrainians and Belarusians. They simply did not exist, and they should not exist, as well as we see today in Putin's attempt to eradicate Ukraine's existence. This mythology allowed to claim Ruthenians into Muscovites, under the common name of Russians, and to establish the pattern of Ukraine denial, which paved the way to subsequent policies of assimilation and extermination. That's what we observe today. Even today, when all the consequences of that myth of Ukraine denial and of discursive delegitimization came to the fore, still there are quite a few, I would say a lot of texts which reproduce the myth, basic tenets of that myth, of basic assumptions of that myth. Just, you know, another anecdotal example, just yesterday, I happened to read an article by a former Canadian diplomat in Moscow who, like many people who have some Russian experience, many of them believe they have also expertise in Ukraine. They do not hesitate to comment also on Ukraine because, you know, what's the difference? And here is very typical for this kind of experts passage, which I believe would have passed unnoticed in most cases. Very few readers, I'm sure, very few readers would stumble over this passage, just because it's very typical. It's really a kind of common wisdom. So it's a very short quotation. This, you know, expert, self-proclaimed expert on Ukraine says, half a millennium ago, the first modern gatherers of the Russian lands found themselves face to face with a technologically advanced and military superior West. So what he says that half a millennium ago, the first modern gatherers of the Russian lands did something. Half a millennium ago, it's probably beginning of 16th century. Yes, if we count properly, it's early 16th century. It was a time when there was no Russian lands, just because there was no Russia. Russia was invented 100 years later. So there was nothing to gather at the time. Yeah, probably they often meant Rus lands, but it's another matter. It's another problem. Rus, of course, they could be claimed, and they were claimed. They were conquered eventually by Moscow. But you know, but these claims are logically they are nearly as ridiculous as Romanian hypothetical claims to the lands of the former Roman Empire. Oh, we are lucky that Bucharest had never been strong enough to gather these lands and to declare Italians, for example, like, you know, little Romanians. But it belongs to what we call alternative history. It's good for some utopian novels. I'd like to now to show you some results of this imperial knowledge, some consequences of this imperial knowledge, which are very, I would say, very disastrous. First of all, of course, for Ukraine, because Ukraine is in the core of it, it's the epicenter. But not only for Ukraine, it's, as we know, for Europe, and including even for Russia itself, because it fails to modernize, it fails to develop modern national identity and modern acquire modern values and to transform outdated, antiquated empire into a modern nation. So it's also a problem. Of course, it's not my problem, but unfortunately, we have to deal with this problem. It's very painful and painstaking way. I'd like to show you a couple of pictures if I manage to pass to this full screen. Let me see, where is, just a moment, because I'm not very skillful in operating of Zoom. Screen share, I have screen share, and I have my my PowerPoint. Okay. I'd like to show you a couple of slides which actually explain why I use this strange formula, Novaya Nation. Novaya Nation comes actually from the article of Jack Matlock. Jack Matlock was another diplomat who spent some time in Moscow and who also came to believe that he has some expertise on Ukraine. This, as I mentioned, it's quite typical. Many people who've been to Moscow and who know some language, some Russian language, of course, they believe sincerely probably that they are also specialists on Ukraine. And he published this article under this name. You can see this title again in reputable New York Review of Books, entitled "The Nowhere Nation." It was about Ukraine. He tried to explain what Ukraine is. There are a lot of the title actually reflects the level of his knowledge, of competence. So I wouldn't bother you with quotation from this article, but this was very typical approach to the new, largely unknown nation, because Ukraine did not exist on mental maps of most people. Suddenly it appeared in the 1990s. There was need to explain what it was, and explanation went like this: Nowhere Nation. Or there was another explanation also in the New York Review of Books with, you can see to the left, this title featured by Abraham Bromberg, "A Nasty New Ukraine." This is how Ukraine looked from the point of view of American intellectuals. Nasty New Ukraine. Why nasty? Just because it was in the early 90s, it refused to give up for nothing nuclear arms. So there was the only interest of Americans at the time was about nuclear arms. Ukraine was perceived only from this point of view. Nothing else was of any interest. And even reputable scholars like Andrew Wilson also succumbed to temptation to define the country in such a way. It was popular view. So his book, History of Ukraine, had a subtitle. You can see here to the left: "Unexpected Nation," Ukraine's unexpected nation. This book was republished 4 times. This is 4th edition, and only the 5th, the new edition, which appeared last year, it appeared without this subtitle. So Ukrainians finally proved that they are not so much unexpected. So the new edition of Andrew Wilson's books has, this subtitle removed finally. So much about. Okay, and now I try to move back from the screen. Let me see. Okay. So to sum up, as I mentioned, this imperial knowledge had very harmful impact on development of many countries, but specifically of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine suffered most. Imperial knowledge made the country invisible for a long time, and even when it appeared, it still was a problem to recognize, to come to terms with its existence, which was very convenient for Moscow, because Moscow very skillfully plays this this international ignorance and manipulated not only Ukraine but also international opinion. So actually, we still can see some vestiges of these manipulations. About the consequences. Of course, first of all, it was failure to understand the Soviet Union as an empire. And of course, it was failure to predict its collapse. And of course, it was failure to apply proper policies vis-a-vis the post-Soviet states. The result was the dominant Russia first policy, which was harmful for both Russia and for post-Soviet republics, Ukraine in particular, because Ukraine was denied any prospects for EU membership or for NATO membership. It was not even considered as some prospective candidate like Albania or Macedonia or Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was really not a state at the time, but still it got this prospect. Other results included, other consequences of the imperial knowledge included Western appeasement vis-a-vis Russia, which facilitated consolidation actually of dictatorship in Moscow, and ultimately encouraged revisionist and aggressive policies of Moscow. Ukraine was perceived largely with Moscow help as a highly corrupt and dysfunctional and almost failed state. and also a country with a deeply divided society at the verge of split, at the verge of civil war. So as a result, today's Ukraine's resilience and unity and vitality came as a great surprise, just because, because the image of Ukraine was the opposite. Still, even today, there is no dearth of calls to Ukrainians to negotiate, to compromise and succumb, and to help Putin to spare his face and to avoid humiliations, as if it was our primary and main goal, to care about Putin's face. Again, these calls very often they are coming from professional Moscow agents and from provocateurs, but also there are many people who sincerely express this view, who really believe that it's possible, because Western mentality is very rationalistic, and they believe that all political actors are rational. They cannot imagine that some of them may be absolutely irrational. Some of them may be driven by some crazy ideas, by some obsessions, like, for example, like infamous idea of a global Jewish Masonic conspiracy. So we have these calls. We have failure to understand that Ukraine wages essentially anti-colonial war. And it's also very important because Ukraine, unfortunately, did not finish its national liberation in 1991. It was postponed, it was frozen. Ukraine didn't achieve the full mental emancipation from the former empire, which was skillfully played eventually by Moscow. Also it was supported by Western tacit recognition of Russian sphere of influence. Well, Ukraine was not engaged into European integration processes, largely because it was assigned to Russian sphere of influence, unspeakably, tacitly. So, because of deeply ingrained, deeply internalized imperial knowledge, many experts, even today in the West, they cannot understand, cannot recognize that this war is not about territory. It's not about NATO expansion, about Ukraine's Finlandization and something like this, not about Crimea and many other things. It's about identity. First of all, it's about identity. And of course, it's about freedom, about dignity, about decolonization. It's about very existence of Ukraine. And Ukrainians perfectly understand this. When in opinion surveys, they express their desire to fight till the end, as long as needed. It's not because they are so militant. It's not they are so nationalistic, and of course not because they like to suffer and to live in darkness and under shelling and under Russian missiles. They simply understand that there is no other way. They simply cannot. Compromise, because they should either win or perish. That's a very, very simple and very tragic situation. But still, there are these calls, and we have to respond to this. We have to dismiss, to fight this imperial knowledge which is behind these calls for peace, for negotiations, and so on. I'd like to draw here a very sad, very bitter ironical, I would say, parallel to very similar Western failure to understand the essence of rogue regimes, which goes back to 1930s. And here you may see a quotation from New York Times. Not this time it's not New York Review of Books, it's New York Times. And it's quotation from the article which was published in 1934 by a reputable American professor who very seriously, exactly like today's peacemakers who appeal to Ukraine to peace negotiations, he also in a very similar way argued that maybe we have to reach some compromise with Hitler. It's why not? He should be rational. He should come to understand it. And he's very it could be funny if it was not so sad. This quotation. As a professor, American professor, in 1934, argued in New York Times, quote, by hating Hitler and trying to fight back, Jews are only increasing the severity of his policies against them. If Jews throughout the world try to instill into the minds of Hitler and his supporters recognition of the ideas for which the race stands, and if Jews appeal to the German sense of justice and German national conscience, I am sure the problem will be solved more effectively and earlier than otherwise. I deliberately made a screenshot from that publication. It's accessible, by the way. The entire archive of New York Times now is accessible online. So you may go there and you may take a look. Here is screenshot from New York Times. It looks like this. So you may read it once again. It's very serious arguments by a highbrow professor. And once again, I'd like to emphasize that these arguments are very similar to those which we Ukrainians hear today from various Western corners. Not only Western, there are a lot of the same advices from global South, but no, they could be less competent. Yeah, they may have their own biases, and it's another matter. I'm not going to discuss it right now. But Western academia, Western political class, they were infected, unfortunately, by this imperial knowledge, which dominated Western academia, Western universities. All the textbooks by Resanovsky and such likes, they disseminated this knowledge. Absolutely, people learn to uncritically accept the very idea of continuity between Moscow, between Rus and Moscow, between Russia and Rus, even though they, these entities existed, in the distance of 500 years and more than 1,000 kilometers as far away from each other. But nonetheless, we have this very difficult task to fight, to disprove, to deconstruct imperial knowledge. As any knowledge, it's social construction, so it can be deconstructed, and this is the task of intellectuals. So when my American colleagues ask me what can we do for Ukraine, I say, first of all, you have to revise your syllabi, you have to revise your textbooks, you have to do your job, first of all, in your own university, because all the universities, all the Western knowledge is deeply infected by this, by Russian imperial wisdom. So it should be deconstructed. Of course, first of all, we have to start with purging this nonsensical formulas like Kiev and Russia, instead of Kiev and Rus. It should not exist. It's as nonsensical as to say ancient Romania instead of ancient Rome. It makes no sense, but so no serious scholar should use such a formula. Nonetheless, they still are very popular. And of course, we have very difficult task to rewrite the entire history of not only history of Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe, but also of literature, to revise the canon, to apply more critical approach to classical authors, to recognize that many of them were hardline chauvinists, Dostoevsky in particular, but not only Dostoevsky, and of course many of them were Ukrainophobic, ardently Ukrainophobic. This also should be named by its proname. To call a spade is actually task of all intellectuals. And of course, we have to recognize that culture is not neutral. It's very popular mistake shared by many intellectuals, which influences today's discussion about cancellation of Russian culture. The main argument is that culture should be beyond the politics, like sport, like something else, should be depoliticized. Unfortunately, not. I'd like it to be beyond politics, But I'm afraid that during the war, no soft power is really soft. Any kind of soft power during the war contributes to the hard power. Any soft power during the war enhances hard power, strengthens, in a way gentrifies and glorifies the rogue regime. Because, you know, subconsciously it induces ideas that, you know, well, maybe this regime is rogue, but it has high culture. It may be, you know, they might be criminals in Moscow, but they have Dostoevsky and Pushkin. No? So, you know, implicitly it suggests that probably it should be maybe not forgiven, but somehow mitigated our judgment. Symbolically, it enhances the rogue regime, the rogue state. So I fully agree with my colleagues who argue that this is not only Putin's war, it's also Pushkin's war, it's also Dostoevsky's war, and of course it's Bulgakov's war. What is remarkable here is that Russian ideologists, Putinist ideologists, they understand it perfectly well. They understand it much better than some Western intellectuals. Here is also very interesting quotation from Mikhail Petrovsky, who was and still is director of famous Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and who is very staunch supporter of Vladimir Putin. And in one of his interviews, not long ago, last year, he said, quote, "Our recent exhibitions abroad are just a powerful cultural offensive. If you want, it's a kind of special operation, which a lot of people don't like, but we are coming, and no one can be allowed to interfere with our offensive." So you recognize this terminology, special operation, you know what special operation means. And he defines expansion, export of Russian culture abroad as special operation. He perfectly understands what it means. He is aware of significance of culture. Unfortunately, Western intellectuals, many of them do not understand this as well as Mr. Petrovsky understands. So I advise some of them wisdom of Mr. Petrovsky, at least in regard of understanding what culture is, what culture during the war means. So, you know, I don't call for here for full and complete cancellation of Russian culture, but I believe that during the war it should be just put aside. For some time we have to freeze it. We have just, you know, to wait, and after the war we may revitalize it, reconsider, re-examine, to create new hierarchy, new commentaries. So there is a huge job, and we may start this preparation job now, right now, but we should be very careful, very aware about, you know, this soft power of culture. Soft power works during the war for it strengthens hard power, whether we like it or not. So much actually about our decolonization tasks. There are a lot of them, and I cannot list, but generally I outlined what should be done. First of all, we should deconstruct imperial knowledge. Imperial knowledge was constructed in a very peculiar way, and we have to deconstruct it very carefully, step by step, different levels and different areas, different regions. I stop here, and I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any, and I believe you should have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riabchuk. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen, or I can stop it for you, however is most.
Yes. Just a moment. I apologize because, you know, I have problems with management of. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for these really, I will say, enlightening and thought-provoking, and I'm sure discussion-provoking remarks. We already have a question in the chat. First, we have praise from Dr. Tatiana Hranchak. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. These are exactly the conclusions I needed to hear. And then Petro Kuzik. I don't know, Petro, if you would like to unmute and ask your question, or I can ask it for you. Let me know. I don't know if you're in a position where you can ask your question, but I'll read the question out. So this will be the first question from Petro Kuzik. My question relates to your well-known thesis about Ukraine's post-colonialism. Can you please clarify when and under what conditions, if ever, will Ukraine eventually overcome this state?
I followed Marko Pavlishin. He's writing about his terminology and his usage of post-colonialism, of the term post-colonialism, and all the time I had some doubts about applicability of this term in regard of Ukraine. It was more of wishful thinking than reality, because Ukraine did not complete its anti-colonial struggle, its anti-colonial war. So I argued that we have to keep in mind this, post-coloniality as some desirable situation. We should achieve this level of freedom when we are not preoccupied with any kind of struggle. When all these issues like these colonial narratives, anti-colonial narratives, they are in the past. For us, they are just part of history and part of philological or maybe cultural or ideological examination, but they are not live anymore. So we may achieve this in the future when countries are really free, and of course I can imagine the situation. Actually, there are countries which live in such conditions, like, for example, Spain, largely already overcome its legacy of civil war and all these contradictions. But still, it's a very long way. We observe this even in the United States, how it's difficult to reconcile, between South and North, between different views of history and different ideologies. So it's a very long way, but actually it's desirable, very desirable future, post-colonial situation of freedom and of irrelevance of all these past grudges and resentments. And so far, Ukraine has very tough, very difficult anti-colonial struggle. So we cannot completely avoid it, we cannot deny it, we have to employ anti-colonial narrative, but at the same time we have to remember that the danger of mirroring colonial narratives. Very often anti-colonial narratives, they are simplified, they just mirror very crude colonial narratives, and of course this undermines intellectual power of these anti-colonial narratives. So of course we should be aware in this regard. Recently I happened to praise Ukrainian humor during the war. I found that Ukrainian cartoons, Ukrainian memes in the internet are much more witty, much more interesting than Russian, probably because Ukrainians are freer. Russian humor is very, frankly speaking, very stupid, very Soviet style. It's like Journal Crocodile. Ukrainians are more inventive, but not all of them. There are also a lot of humor which is very similar to Russian, just mirror image of Russian jokes and so on, which is not very, very funny. So we have to be aware of this, and we have to understand that this anti-colonial stage is we cannot jump over. We have to pass it. We have to win the war, anti-colonial war, and then we can discuss our post-colonial condition.
Thank you, Natalia Shulga. Your hand is up. It's so wonderful to see you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for creating this wonderful conference. Pane Mykola, my question is about Ukrainian presence in Western academia. You mentioned before that the whole notion of Ukraine is kind of polluted by many decades and maybe centuries of pro-Russian imperial academic education. So what would be, in your opinion, our strategy to wait until we win the war and we will go through the process of decolonization and then start doing something serious about Ukrainian presence in Western academia? Or we should start right now, before all this process will be completed, not by canceling Russian centers or Russian languages in Western academia, but creating and enhancing Ukrainian presence in all of that existing Slavic studies centers or Slavic centers of languages and stuff like that. What would be your recommendation? Should we wait or should we do it right away, right now? Like conferences like this, for example. Thank you very much.
My short answer is, of course, we should do it right away. We have very actually convenient situation for this because there is substantial empathy and sympathy for Ukraine. There is some interest in Ukraine, and of course, it's very favorable for us to develop Ukrainian studies and to promote Ukrainian knowledge as alternative to imperial knowledge. So, of course, we shouldn't wait. We should do everything that is possible now just to use this favorable situation. On the other hand, of course, we can expect that after the war, we may expect some stronger support from state institutions, from non-government institutions, which now are preoccupied with other matters. So this may compensate the inevitable loss of interest in Ukraine eventually, because of course this interest cannot last forever. It would gradually decline. So it should be compensated by some more systemic investment of government and also non-government sponsors in Ukrainian studies. But we should start now. I just want to remind that Ukrainians actually started from a very long position. I remember memoirs of different Ukrainian scholars of all the generation in the West who struggled actually for recognition. Most of them actually lived in the world where Ukrainian studies did not exist and were denied and were considered as something very, very, very suspicious. It was kind of mental obsession or maybe nationalism, and it was really a big problem. And if you take a look at biography of prominent Ukrainian scholars of all the generations, all of them did their career at some adjacent areas, not in Ukrainian studies. Omelian Pritsak was Orientalist. He dealt with Turkic studies. Igor Shevchenko was Byzantologist. Shpurlyuk wrote about Masaryk and so on. So no, all of them, actually even Lutsky, he wrote about Ukrainian literature, but basically it was about Soviet, part of Soviet processes, literary process of 1930s, and on and on. So all of them were basically denied proper access to academia. They were marginalized artificially. They had to survive in the margins. It was a very tragic situation. Today, of course, it's much better. Even since 1991, it became better because the country emerged on the map. So it inevitably attracted more and more people, young people, not necessarily of Ukrainian origin. I'm very happy that there are a lot of foreigners today engaged in Ukrainian studies in different countries, from America to Japan and India and Indonesia. So it's really great, and it's really a good chance. So we have some background upon which to build, because 30 years passed, and the entire generation of Ukrainian scholars emerged in the West, young or not so young already scholars. But also Ukraine is also in the center of attention. We have to build upon this. We have to very actively be engaged.
Thank you so much. I'll just note that we have about 12 minutes left with our time together. We have 3 questions lined up. So I really hope that we can get everyone's questions and your responses in. This is such an important conversation. Professor Russell Valentino, please.
Hi, thank you. Absolutely fantastic presentation. I have a question for you. The centrality of academic discourse comes through quite a bit in your presentation, and the importance of writing history textbooks and textbooks for language and all sorts of other academic endeavors. But I wonder if the heart of these sort of, what should I call it, phenomena associated with imperial knowledge hasn't shifted, or maybe even was always rooted in a slightly different part of society, which is on the edges, on the margins of academia. You quote from the New York Review of Books, which is a popular, it's one of the most popular review publications in the United States. Even though academics write in it, they don't write necessarily academic works there. They're writing, again, on the margins. And then when you start delving into popular culture representations, it becomes even more outside. I wish that it was more in academia, because I can have an impact there. I can intervene in the process. Whereas in popular representations, especially those that developed over the generations of the Cold War, it's just so pervasive to not only replace the USSR with Russia, where it is usually a demonized enemy figure. It's a spy in the novel, or it's the enemy in the television series. But also it carries on these assumptions that there aren't any other aspects to the USSR in those years, and therefore all of these other countries don't really exist either. And there I don't have much access at all. I can watch them. I can say that's wrong. I can write a letter. But my status as an academic doesn't help very much. They have their own business model, I think. And so in those cases, I'm wondering, how do we intervene? Maybe you have some ideas, but I'm also wondering whether you see the center as having shifted, that idea that the center of the notions that come out of this imperial knowledge paradigm isn't really in our control as academics.
Well, I'd like to be optimistic about this. So on the one hand, I recognize that, of course, there is a gap, and this gap will always exist between this, professional, high-level knowledge, academic knowledge of peer-reviewed journals, which is really controlled. There is some quality control. And popular knowledge, which tends to be simplified, which employs and exploits and benefits from various stereotypes and mental shortcuts. So this gap is inevitable. But on the other hand, I'd like to understand the entire culture as a connected vessel. They are connected. Despite all these gaps and ruptures, they are connected. And of course, they penetrate each other. So if we develop good high-level academic knowledge, eliminate completely all the remnants of this imperial falsities, of course, it would influence slowly, incoherently, gradually, but it would influence all other levels of knowledge, even pop culture. It wouldn't change radically, but still, it would be less and less suitable to pronounce some stupidities. Today, for example, it's, as I observe, it's unacceptable to write about Kiev and Russia in academic journals. I cannot find these formulas in serious scholarship. So it was eliminated already. Finally, it's disappeared from reviewed, from refereed publications. but it should go down. It should go to mass culture, to newspapers, because actually journalists are students. They listen to professors. They learn. They get this knowledge from professors. Politicians also obtain this knowledge from professors. So of course we have to start from academia. It's very narrow circle. I understand it's maybe not very influential. It has no direct influence on Hollywood films. But it influence other experts, politicians, journalists, and all these people who listen to professors. So step by step, I'd like to believe in this evolutionary development. So it's maybe naive hope, but what else can we do?
Thank you. I have good news. I'm an anthropologist, not a mathematician, and I wrongly calculated the time we have left. So I'm delighted to tell you we have about 17 minutes left. So fantastic. I'm going to read a question from the chat, and then we'll get to you, Ludmila. A question from the chat from Olga Filipova. Pani Mykola, you mentioned about knowledge production about Ukraine by researchers and Western researchers particularly. And this knowledge has formed perceptions about Ukraine as a split country. My question is, how do you evaluate the contribution of your concept of two Ukraines to this perception about splitness of Ukraine? That's question one. And number two, what do you think about social responsibility of publicists and intellectuals, which I think really builds on the question Professor Valentino had as well. So please.
Well, it's a very tough question because my views changed in time, but I believe that since early 2000s, I developed more or less coherent and comprehensive view of so-called two Ukraines. Even before that, of course, there were some extremes. There were too naive, too optimistic view of eventual development, catching up development of East Ukraine, of Soviet Ukraine, non-Habsburgian Ukraine. This catch-up modernization didn't occur in terms of national identity. So, and maybe my reaction to this disappointment, my kind of resentment provoked me to write some opposite, very pessimistic view about, different fundamental differences of these two regions, two civilizational realms. But eventually, partly because of my own readings, partly because of criticism of my friends, since early 2000s, I believe I developed more balanced view of this. I came to understand that we have to speak not about, we have to speak about Ukraine not in terms of real regions, really existing regions, but first of all about two different projects in terms of Weberian ideal types. We have two ideal types, like Max Weber outlines them, which do not exist in reality, but which create some frameworks for analysis. We can compare real phenomena with these ideal types. It helps to analyze them, and in this regard, of course, it works. We have these two different projects. Ukraine, from the very emergence as independent state, was basically pursued two different projects, and all the political fighting was about this or that model of the future. What was underestimated and misunderstood, especially by foreigners, and what I try to explain in my intellectual arguments, that Ukraine, even though there were two different projects, both of them were Ukrainian. So it was not about, Ukraine vis-a-vis Russian or something like this. It was about two different models, two different types, two different ways of being Ukrainian. Central European model, which follows Baltic way and Polish and so on, way of development, post-communist development, and so to say, East Slavonic or Eurasian, which follows, Russian, Belarusian, Kazakhstan, which was more ambivalent. It was also Ukrainian, but it was ambivalent. It was mentally divided, undecided between, this Western European choice and Eurasian resentment. It was kind of infantile consciousness which naively hope to combine belonging to both worlds, to eat the cake and to still have it. Putin persuaded many of these people that it's impossible. I believe many came to understand this in 2014, and now it's the ultimate end of this naivete, of this ambivalence. You cannot have both. You have to choose whether you like it or not. But you cannot be in the European Union and at the same time maintain good relations with Putin's Moscow. That's ultimate decisions. So I all the time I spoke about correlation. Of course, there is huge correlation between these two projects and all other factors like region, like language, like ethnicity, like age, like education. All these factors correlate with probability, lower or higher probability of support for this or that project. But it's not, it's not causation. It's correlation, but not causation. And this fundamental difference, what I'd like to emphasize once again, is that, if you have causation, we would have really divided society. We would have something like Bosnia or Kosovo, or whatever. This is really divided. In Ukraine, it's correlation, which means that, it's higher probability that a person who live in Donetsk and speaks Russian, probably it's more likely that he would be more sympathetic for Russia. But it's probability, not necessarily, and vice versa. And this makes Ukraine very stable, actually. Because you can find different people in different groups. It's correlation works both ways. You cannot imagine, for example, in Bosnia, Serbs who opted for Bosnian cause, who supported Bosnians in this, war, because it was really civil war. In Ukraine, it was not civil war. There are a lot of Russian speakers and other people of other ethnicity who opted for Ukrainian side because of political loyalty, political affiliation and commitment. So it's much more complicated case, and we have to remember, we have to distinguish correlation and causation.
Thank you. And we'll move now to a question from Ludmila. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. I would have a question concerning Russian liberals, or so-called good Russians. How do they evaluate that phenomenon? Although some of them proclaim that they are against Putin's policy, but still have that imperial mindset. Do they work for Ukraine or against Ukraine? Thank you.
I don't follow closely their statement. It's not my primary concern, and basically, from my point of view, it's a very marginal group. So whatever they say is not so important because they have no influence in Russia. They have some influence in the West, largely exaggerated because they are still perceived as representatives of something which they are not. So, frankly speaking, I don't care much. But as a rational person, I believe that, anybody who is not against us is for us. So I don't accept this Bolshevik approach that, opposite, that who not with us is against us. No, some people may not be with us, but if they are not against us, that's okay. That's also okay. So I rather support broad coalition. All the people who are against Putin, it's okay. It's at least they can be some sort of situational allies. On the other hand, they are not. We have to understand they are not important. They really play no role, or very little role, very limited role. I wish them good. I wish them to survive, not to go to prison and so on. But basically, we have to understand they're very limited. The fate of Ukraine is solved in Ukraine. First of all, in Ukraine. So. Let them be. Some of them are quite good people, and I know many of them. No, some of them in person, and very nice people. As long as they do not represent Russia, as long as they represent themselves, just as X, Y, and so on. Okay, we can communicate. We can talk. We can discuss. but it's something different when they are represented as as representatives of Russia, either official or not official, of Putin's Russia or anti-Putin's Russia. In both cases, I don't want to discuss with any representatives of any Russia, just only with concrete, with specific individuals.
Thank you. I will take the opportunity to read a few kudos from the chat from Svetlana Malikhina. She says, "Dear Professor Riabchuk, thank you for your inspiring presentation today. Also, thank you for your years of research, your depth of understanding of Ukrainian society, and your ability to present the subject in such an interesting way." So thank you, Svetlana. And then we have another note from Annie Fisher, who says, in addition to thanking Professor Riabchuk for his excellent talk and wise guidelines, thanks also to the speakers and conference organizers for making presentations available in both languages, Ukrainian and English. Kudos to our excellent, hardworking conference interpreters. I cannot agree more, Annie. Thank you for the shout out to the two wonderful interpreters, Andrew and Yuri, who are doing a wonderful job again today. And then Andriy Pasunko, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and verbalize your quote.
Well, again, it's black humor, but it's wartime humor. And in current Ukrainian, contemporary Ukrainian, хороший русский is euphemism for Russian casualties in Ukraine.
Yeah, no comment necessary. Thank you for that.
Yeah, alas.
Alas, yes. So we have 5 more minutes.
Well,
Time for questions, time for comments, interventions. While we have Dr. Riabchuk with us.
everything's clear.
Okay, yes, Natalia Shulga, please.
Well, I didn't want to abuse some opportunity to ask more questions, but evidently it's a lot of questions toward the education system, not only for Ukrainian system, which should overcome and be kind of instrumental in this post-colonial life, so what it should be. And in terms of that, what is your prediction? Would we be able to engage all those educators who left Ukraine, and it is thousands? All those children, school children, it's 500,000 in European Union now, to come back with their parents with this experience, so they can serve as advocates for the education rethinking. I don't want to even use the term reform, which I was working so hard for so many years. And also, what do you think about intellectual diaspora of Ukrainian heritage, which will not come back, but we might find a way to engage it in all of that transformation processes? And your opinion about education first, because that's my pain. This is my inspiration, and this is my hope. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's a very, very good question, and it's very complicated. It requires probably another panel, another conference, what to do with education, with the Academy of Sciences, and so on. I have rather ambivalent feeling about that. So on the one hand, I understand that it's inevitable. We live in a global world and people migrate and people move here and there. So far, I believe it's quite beneficial because the Ukrainians have opportunity to learn something abroad, to acquire some Western knowledge, to read good textbooks and books in general, and to make some connections and contacts. It's very, very good, very fruitful. Also, it's good because they also fill these gaps, this lack of knowledge about Ukraine. They share their knowledge, and not all of them, but some of them, or maybe many of them, they teach some courses, they deliver some lectures, participate in some seminars. So they carry out kind of educational work, enlightening work, kulturträger work. So it's on the positive side. Whether they will come back, it's a big problem. It's a problem not only with education, problem with Ukrainians in general, because of course, so far, most Ukrainians abroad, they declare their will, their desire to come back. And in most cases, I believe it's quite sincere. They would like to, of course. But at the same time, we have to understand that not all of them. And of course, the longer the war lasts, people are less likely to come back because they just, they are rooted. They find jobs, some of them set families, find housing, and so it's more and more difficult to come back. Probably some people will return, some not, but those who return, they would return, of course, with new knowledge, new experience, and we can expect some, an enhancement of general level of Ukraine, I hope. Also, I believe this openness, general openness, this dynamics works both way, and people are able to travel and to teach courses both in the West, both abroad and in Ukraine. I have a daughter who is currently teaching in Paris, in Alcourt. But she also has a seminar in Mykola Academy. She never stopped their seminars in Mykola, and she's very committed to this work, much more than to teaching in Paris. I think she's not alone. I believe there are many young scholars of this kind. What is important here in this situation? What is beneficial? That this openness creates some sort of competition, some challenge for old unreformed institutions in Ukraine. Luckily, all these dinosaurs institutions, they should either reform or die. But they don't have monopoly. What is crucial here is that neither Academy of Sciences nor universities, they have no monopoly. They can, scholars, talented scholars, they have a choice. They can move to other institutions, either in Ukraine or abroad. So they are not enslaved, as it was in Soviet times when you had no choice. Luckily, and also it's also stimulating in terms of studying languages and so on. It's very good if people can go for some time abroad. I advise all Ukrainians to travel abroad. All students should go there. Actually, there are a lot of European programs of this kind which encourages exchange of students. It's very, very helpful. It was helpful and useful since Middle Ages when students moved from university to university. It was a new important experience. Let it be in Ukraine. I believe there are positive and negative aspects of this, and we have somehow to support and to develop positive aspects, benefit from positive aspects, and to mitigate as much as possible negative aspects. That's all.
Dr. Riabchuk, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been such a wonderful keynote address and conversation, a conversation that we will continue the rest of this afternoon and evening and into tomorrow. So it's time now for our break, and we will reconvene at noon Eastern Time, USA, 6 o'clock p.m. Kyiv time for our next panel which is what is Ukrainian about Ukrainian literature. We have a wonderful, wonderful lineup and hope everyone can stay and take part in the next session at noon. That is 13 minutes from now. And thank you again, Dr. Riabchuk, for your wonderful, wonderful talk.